All right, Keith Idec is back, longtime boxing writer, good friend of the program. And Keith, we're going to begin this show where I just want you to kind of sit back and let me kind of riff for a second here, because I've got to go on a little bit of a rant about the state of the 147-pound division, because this has been bothering me all weekend long as I've been following the social media back and forth between several of the champions at 147. It's been kind of a maddening situation. So, what's happening right now at welterweight is kind of encapsulates everything that's wrong with boxing, right? You've got four title holders, as I mentioned: Boots Ennis, Brian Norman, Amanta Stanionis, and Mario Barrios. None of them right now have fights scheduled. This weekend, as I mentioned, three of them spent time on social media and in some interviews talking about how they want the fights, but they weren't being offered the right amount of money for the fights. And I'm telling you, Keith, my blood was not literally, but it was boiling because I feel like I know how this story ends. But for people that don't know the situation at 147, let me just lay it out for them. You got Stanionis, who is going to be the WBA full title holder at 147 once the Crawford stuff is cleared up. He has fought once in the last 2.5 years. Not his fault. Last year was a lost one because of the Virgil Ortiz health issues. But he has fought once, and that was back in May. Nothing scheduled this year. No indication that anything is cooking. Mario Barrios has the WBC belt, and he has been a little more active, but right now he's sitting around basically waiting for a Manny Pacquiao fight that's never going to happen. My understanding is that Pacquiao's dreadful performance in that last exhibition last month officially ended any real plans for him to make a comeback for a world title fight. Someone close to Pacquiao told me that Pacquiao's focus right now is on these upcoming Senate elections. Could do another exhibition, but right now the Senate is more of a priority for Manny Pacquiao. Brian Norman has been at the center of this. He has been presented an offer to fight Boots Ennis. His team says they countered. Meanwhile, Norman, his dad, Eddie Hearn, who promotes Boots, they say they rejected it. If Norman does not fight Boots, he is being penciled in for a title defense on the undercard of Keyshawn Davis fighting in Virginia. Now, let me repeat, the undercard of a Keyshawn Davis fight. That is, to me, a complete waste of time, though not as big a waste of time as what Boots Ennis is looking at. Because if Boots Ennis cannot get a unification fight, he is facing a mandatory defense against Karen Shukajan. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it probably should. It was just last year that Shukajan was shut out by Boots in a fight that he made zero effort to win. Zero effort. He's won 3-0 fights in a row, and the IBF, in all its wisdom, has made him the mandatory for that exact same belt. This is really, Keith, like a movie studio putting out a box office bomb and then quickly ordering a sequel. It's like the boxing equivalent of seeing Geely and saying, you know what, fuck it, let's give Ben and J-Lo another go at it. It makes no sense whatsoever that this fight is back on the table. So Boots needs a unification fight to avoid shoving that crap down our throats. So this to me is just mind-blowing how this is all playing out, because I firmly believe, Keith, that 2 months from now, we're either going to be talking about these title holders being inactive with no fights or taking crappy title defenses. What say you?
Well, Chris, Karan Shakadzian, it was viewed as a victory for him to go the distance with Boots Ennis. It ended a long knockout streak by
Is that how you
Boots
say
Ennis,
his name?
short
I
of
was only going by Mauro Ranallo's pronunciation of that fight.
from when I covered his fight last year, because I covered the Ennis Chikadzean fight
Yeah,
from ringside. It was on the Gervonta Davis undercard down in
that's the phonetic
DC.
way to say it, I think. I don't know what.
Yeah, and so anyway, it's not as much fun as we all had with it that Boots was fighting a Karen. His name is pronounced Karan in Ukraine. So Karan Shakadzian, I believe, is how it's pronounced. However it's pronounced, we shouldn't need to know how to pronounce it, because he should, under no circumstances, be the number one contender in the IBF again. These sanctioning organizations oftentimes do egregious things that make our jobs very easy, Chris, because they just They're like lobbing softballs to Aaron Judge, basically. So,
Big fat ones.
really, I mean, so this is more perplexing maybe than anything that the IBF has done in recent years, and that's saying a lot. I mean, the IBF, of course, is the New Jersey-based organization that tends to stick to its rules more than the others who tend to make up their rules as they go along and as it
Part
suits
because they
them.
were raided by the FBI many years ago. So yeah, that's
Right, and they once upon a time had an FBI monitor in their office after taking bribes to rank fighters and everything. And I know the FBI has far more important things on its plate at this point, particularly with the divisiveness in our country and a presidential candidate being someone trying to assassinate him, and they have more important things to do than monitor boxing rankings. At the same time, maybe it's time to get the FBI back involved with the IBF, because there's nothing that anyone could tell us from the IBF, Daryl Peoples, who I like. I mean, but there is nothing that anyone could tell us that would make any sort of sense for ordering a rematch between Jaron Ennis and Karan Chikadze. Chikadze's a good, look, he's fine. I mean, he's a legitimate top 15 guy. He went the distance with Boots, but he lost virtually every second of every round of a 12-round fight. He got shut out on all three scorecards. There is absolutely, positively no need to see them in the ring together ever again. So for him to go and win three relatively nondescript fights against non-ranked, maybe they're ranked by the IBF, but that's not saying a lot. They're not top 10 welterweights that he's beaten. And even if they were, what would be the real justification for getting him in the ring with Jaron Ennis again? It makes virtually no sense. And if Matchroom in this case, because they're Jaron Ennis' new promoter, if Eddie Hearn and his company have to pay for that rematch, how are you going to go about selling that to the people of Philadelphia who just turned out for Boots' fight? They sold, I think the announced attendance was 14,000 or something. It was the biggest crowd for a boxing match in Philadelphia in decades. And it proved that Jaron Ennis, one of the elite talents in the sport, while still having something to prove, is a real gate attraction. He proved that. They were more than willing to come back by the end of the year with some semblance of a real fight. And then you get stuck with this. Brian Norman would have been a real fight. Jaron Ennis would obviously be heavily favored to beat Brian Norman. Brian Norman's a pretty big puncher. He's a fun fighter, abandons defense. He's made for good TV so far, and good for him for getting in the position and winning a fight. Maybe some people thought that he was going to lose, but he's a young guy. He makes for good TV. And yes, we all would have liked to have seen him take this fight against Jaron Ennis. They might have some other plans at Top Rank for him. The bottom line, though, as it relates to Jaron Ennis, is how would you go about selling that fight to the people of Philadelphia or the people of anywhere? Because there's just no point to the fight happening. And really, someone has to answer for this. And they tend not to answer the phone or emails or whatever when they don't want to discuss what they know they could not really explain in any reasonable way. So someone has to, frankly, if I were Jaron Ennis, I'm going to make my money at 154 pounds anyway. If someone tries to make me go through with this Karan Chikadze fight or get stripped, maybe I just say, you know what? Yeah, I would like to unify the titles, and I could beat Mario Barrios and Imantas Stanionis, who's probably the best, the better between those two fighters, him and Barrios. Would be favored to beat him, would be favored to beat Brian Norman, but maybe just move up to 154 pounds and make your money. Because how would he get, now Boots is a professional, he's a perfectionist, a professional, and, still in the heart of his career, prime of his career. I'm sure he would train hard, but how would he really be able to get himself out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning or whenever he gets up to do his road work and motivate himself to fight Karan Chikadze again? It doesn't make any sense from a business standpoint, from a boxing standpoint, and it's really the epitome of what is wrong with this business.
To go back to the sellable aspect of it, like putting aside like fans, right? Like maybe there are some fans that'll come and watch Boots regardless of who he's fighting. Look, he sold every one of those tickets to that fight against Avanesian. No one was there to see him against David Avanesian. But if you're a network that is going to be on the hook for $3 million, $3.5 million, whatever that fight ultimately would cost, maybe a little bit less. I don't know. Whatever the amount is, like, why are you paying that to how this ends? Like, you know what it's going to look like. Like in the last year and a few months, Chikadze has not become a different fighter. He's not going to go in and stand toe to toe with Boots Ennis after going 12 rounds with him. He's going to probably do the exact same thing. So I don't know how you sell that if you're Eddie Hearn to a network, your network, that this is a fight worth investing in. I don't know how you do it.
Yeah,
That's the yeah. Go ahead.
no, but and there are plenty of times when we can point the finger at Eddie Hearn for maybe making some fights that people don't want to see or whatever. That goes for every promoter. I mean, they get stuck with fights, they make fights that people don't want to see. In this case, he's essentially blameless. What is he supposed to do? I mean, because the thing that I would like to see Jaron Ennis do, and I know it's a tough ask because, I'm not the one getting up, and doing all this road work and all this sparring and building yourself into becoming a world champion. If Jaron Ennis really wants to make a statement, much more so than if he went in there and knocked Karan Chakadze out, which he was unable to do in their first fight. The statement that he could make is tell the IBF, thank you for allowing me to fight for your title a couple of times. I don't want it anymore. If you're mandating that I fight him again, I just don't see any point in doing that. It's a waste of everyone's time and money. I'm going to move forward with my career in a different direction. And I think everyone in boxing would respect Jaron Ennis more. And this isn't his fault either. He didn't ask for this. I mean, Jaron Ennis wants to fight Terrence Crawford. He wants to fight Virgil Ortiz. He wants the biggest and best fights. He's been unable thus far to secure those fights. But it's hard to blame him here either. But the blame lies solely with the IBF. But if I'm Jaron Ennis, I just say, I'm not fighting him again. So let's figure out something else. And if that means moving up to 154, which is inevitable for him anyway, and that's where the real money for him is going to be, maybe that's just what you do. Or, you know what? You say, I'm the uncrowned welterweight champion. And maybe they can go make a fight with Amantes Stanionis or Mario Barrios. I don't know that that would necessarily be easy either, because those two guys are affiliated with PBC, and the more natural thing to do, assuming Manny Pacquiao is removed from this equation, which hopefully he would be to have Mario Barrios and Amantes Stanionis fight each other. And then you have some sort of unified champion, and then you go from there. That would be the easier thing for PBC to do, but that's not a huge fight either. It's a meaningful fight in the sense that you could unify two of the welterweight titles, but it's not a big fight from a marketing standpoint.
It's a co-main on a pay-per-view, maybe
right.
Maybe it headlines an Amazon Prime non-pay-per-view card, but it's not a pay-per-view headliner. The way out for Matchroom and for Boots Ennis seems to be Brian Norman, which I never really thought was realistic until the last few days when, Norman was out there, his father was out there. I'm sure you have had conversations with our best friend, Jolene Mazzone, who insists that they want the fight. Jolene, of course, the manager for Brian Norman, who says they want it, who says they made a counteroffer to the offer that Matchroom made, according to them, as we record this late Monday afternoon. No counteroffer has been given back to them. And then the stuff started to leak out about Brian Norman fighting on the undercard of the Keyshawn Davis fight. Like, if you're Brian Norman, what does that do for you? Like, as bad as a Chukadzian fight is with Boots Ennis, I don't know that a Brian Norman title defense on an undercard is much better for him. I don't know what that does for him, except maybe gets him a quick paycheck that can maybe lead to something better. So, I mean, as we sit here talking about this, do you think that unification fight is dead? Do you have a percentage chance you'd put on that? Like, how do you view Norman Boots?
Well, my guess is that he's going to fight on Keyshawn Davis's undercard, because I don't think they're not going to tell us this, but I don't think that they view Jaron Ennis as a welterweight champion that he could beat at the moment. So if you're them,
them being top rank, you're saying,
basically. Meaning top rank and his management team. I think realistically they would have to look at it like, we have them off. Look, he's made for great TV, and ESPN and Top Rank are trying to put on fights that people will want to watch. Now, he's not a household name or anything like that, but if you go back and watch what he's done in his televised fights, he's someone he's entertaining. So maybe get him into that fight on the Keyshawn Davis undercard. He wins that fight, then you get him another title defense and build toward a unification fight that might be more realistic for him to win. Because I think in a quiet moment, they would tell you that, I'm not saying Brian Norman is afraid to fight Jaron Ennis. So these guys typically are not afraid to fight anyone. It has to make the most business sense. So if you could make good money for a couple of title defenses that you would view as winnable, whereas the fight against Boots would make you more money than either one of those title defenses, but it's a fight that he's not going to say this to himself, and his dad's not going to say this. They think they can beat anyone, as well they should. It's not a fight that he's going to win. So you lose all your leverage almost immediately after winning the title, after being elevated from interim champion to full champion. So I would understand it in that sense. So I don't think that the fight is going to happen next. It would be just based on what we were discussing earlier. No one wants to see the rematch between Ennis and Chikadzian. So hopefully we find some way to go in a different direction than that. But I don't see it being Ennis against Norman. I just don't think it's, from Brian Norman's perspective, I don't think it makes the most sense right now because, and I'm not saying it's a fight he could win in 2 years either. And Jaron Ennis will be out of this division in 2 years anyway. But I don't think it's a fight that they think that they can win, honestly. And I think that's why they'll go in a different direction.
If he was going to fight Teofimo Lopez, I'd be all for it. I mean, that's a marketable fight for Brian Norman. Maybe a winnable fight with Teofimo moving up to 147. But like, it sure sounds like to me that right now Top Rank is kind of scouring those WBO rankings, looking for somebody to fight Brian. And that, I mean, I guess, what are you going to make for that? A couple $100,000, maybe not bad money, but not great either.
They don't have to scour the WBO rankings. They just
get somebody
get someone
who
might
but I mean, I guess
mysteriously appear by next week. Let's just say.
I don't know the numbers. That I would guess that it's $1 million package at least that Brian Norman's being offered to fight Boots Ennis. I think that's reasonable. And look, when I talk to, I usually say like Norman's people, we both talk to Jolene. So I talk to Jolene, like she seemed to suggest that there was room to make this fight happen. If it falls apart over, look, if Brian Norman and his team really don't want it, that's one thing. But if it falls apart over like $100,000, $200,000, something like that, then everybody's stupid and everybody's just being goofy. Because if he really wants to fight, look, it's a fun fight. Two guys that can crack, two guys that are television friendly. I would favor Boots in that fight, but it's a great fight. And at least we'd have something. But right now, the only scenario I can see is what I started with, where Boots is either fighting Chikadzian or in a non-title fight because he dropped the belt. Norman fighting on Keyshawn's undercard in Virginia. That just, oh, God. That's what you're going to do. And, Stanios and Barrios probably idle the rest of the year. Like that to me is kind of where this is trending. And that's maddening. That is why I bring it back. This is what's wrong with boxing, that you're squabbling on social media and not making big fights happen.
And in some ways, Chris, we're starting over. We're starting from scratch in the welterweight division, right? Because most of the last 5 years have been about, or up until last July 29th, the 5 years prior to that were all about making Terrence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr. That's what everyone wanted to see. That was the dominant narrative.
Just what people want to hear. You got we'll go 5 full years to make one of these next big fights.
What I mean by that is it completely consumed the minds of welterweight fans, right? I mean, yeah, we did see Errol Spence fight Sean Porter. Then we saw Sean Porter fight Terrence Crawford. For the most part, everyone wanted to see Crawford and Spence finally go at it. It took up, from the time Errol Spence won the title in 2017, then Terrence Crawford moves up in 2018, beats up Jeff Horn, becomes a champion. It's what we were building toward. And it was a slow build, and it looked like at times like it would never happen. We finally get to that point. And yeah, it was a dud because a lot of things had happened to Errol Spence at that point in time. Terrence Crawford, probably the best pound for pound fighter in the world. He beats him up. The fight was a dud in the sense that it didn't live up to anything that we were expecting it to be. Maybe that part of that was some of what happened to Errol Spence in the car accident, his retina surgery and all that kind of stuff. The point is there was something to look forward to in the welterweight division for those 5 years. And there's a lot of back and forth, and I'm sure people got tired of it at a certain point, but we did finally get to see it. And now you're kind of, Terrence Crawford moves up. Errol Spence is supposed to move up, and who knows what's left of Errol Spence at this point. And Jaron Ennis wanted to fight both of those guys, and now he's just kind of here with these other nondescript welterweight title holders. And it's, well, should I move up? Should I go try to fight Virgil Ortiz if Ortiz isn't going to fight Crawford? So that's kind of the weird position that Jaron Ennis finds himself in, because he's 27. He's right in the heart of his physical prime, and he doesn't want to waste much of that with the types of fights that people don't want to see. So, but this happens a lot of times, even in the glamour divisions of boxing, Chris, as we well know. I mean, in 1999, we got Oscar De La Hoya and Felix Trinidad, and then there was a long time in between when we didn't get a super fight in the welterweight division. Then we eventually got Mayweather-Pacquiao, the fight that everyone wanted to see and made more money than any fight in boxing history. So this is going to just be one of those dormant periods in the division. And hopefully we get some fun fights out of it, some fun competitive fights among guys who are basically at the same level. But I don't think that next fight, unfortunately, is going to be Ennis and Norman. And I would like to see it too, because I think it would be entertaining. Be it on television on ESPN or be streamed by DAZN. I think it would be a fun fight, but I think Jaron Ennis would be heavily favored and rightfully so going into that fight. But Brian Norman can punch, like you said, and they're two young, Black American fighters, and that's good for the sport too. I mean, to have two welterweight title holders from the United States, fighting in a major city in the United States in Philadelphia, that would be great for the business as well.
The takeaway is every 9 years we get a great welterweight fight. So in 2033, get ready. Wow. Mark your calendar, get your popcorn. A big fight's coming to 147. All right, let's talk about 135. Shakur Stevenson, one of the top fighters, maybe the top fighter at 135. He has signed a deal with Matchroom Boxing and with Riyadh Season, the Saudi Arabian company. It is reportedly a 2-fight deal. The first will be October 12th when Shakur defends his title against Joe Cordina. The next one tentatively penciled in, from what I hear, as February against William Zepeda. Like, that is the fight that they want to make in February of next year. Everyone's kind of waiting to see what Shakur was going to do next. What do you think of this decision, this path that Shakur is following now?
Well, my first question, Chris, is when and where is it not Riyadh season? Seems to always be Riyadh season, as we have come to find out.
Annual. It's 12 months a year.
Yes. That aside, as long as Shakur Stevenson's deal with Matchroom does indeed lead to him fighting William Zepeda in February or March or whenever the fight is, as long as it's next, I'm sort of fine with it, or as fine as I can be with him fighting a guy who's not a lightweight and coming off a knockout loss. We'll take the magnifying glass off of the IBF for a second and shift it over to our pal Mauricio Suleiman, who I'm sure will come up with some cockamamie, condescending rationale for this fight making sense, when it does not, because Joe Cordina is a 130-pound fighter who was knocked out by Anthony Cacace in his last fight. There is no reasonable justification for him getting a lightweight title shot coming off of what was a catastrophic loss for him, or should have been a catastrophic loss for him. Joe Cordina is very good. He supposedly had a lot of problems making 130 pounds, but that's on him. He signed up for a 130-pound title fight.
And he kind of got cheap shot in that fight. Not intentionally, maybe cheap shot is the wrong word, but he took it after the break.
Yeah.
Pretty good shot that I think changed the entire course of that fight. But your point still stands. Like, coming off a knockout loss, you are not supposed to be able to walk right into a world title opportunity.
Right. And it's really just acquiescing to whatever the promoter, and in this case, maybe Turki Al-Sheikh, wants, because they're funding Shakur Stevenson's deal with Matchroom to a degree. So you shouldn't be allowing the sanctioning, the promoters to kind of force you into a fight that shouldn't happen just because you're going to get paid for it. But that's what the sanctioning bodies typically do. Despite that they'll tell you otherwise, they're going to collect 3% of the purses from Shakur Stevenson and Joe Cordina. They're going to make a pretty penny off of this fight over there in Riyadh, and that's why they did it. Now, Joe Cordina will he'll almost certainly feel more comfortable at 135 pounds. He's a good boxer. But from Shakur Stevenson's perspective, while this was what he had to do after turning down Top Rank's deal, which would have guaranteed him approximately a minimum of $16 million over the course of 5 fights, maybe not all of which would have been on ESPN, because that's really dependent on whether ESPN renews Top Rank by the end of next June. But some of those fights would have been on ESPN and would have been very visible to boxing fans to see Shakur Stevenson. Now, the smartasses and the naysayers would obviously say, well, we don't want to see Shakur Stevenson fight anymore based on what we've seen in his last 2 fights. So that's a fair argument as well. So maybe if he's buried on a pay-per-view undercard, maybe some fans aren't going to be all that bothered by that. But from his perspective, in terms of being seen by more people, it would have made more sense to fight for Top Rank on ESPN in the short term. But this business ultimately is about money for all fighters, and should be. So despite what might be said about legacy and titles and everything, it's about feeding your family and setting up your kids college funds, paying mortgages, all that type of stuff that fighters have to do for their families. So I don't blame him for doing it, especially after he turned down the Top Rank deal. And then supposedly there were some discussions thereafter about maybe wanting to revisit the Top Rank deal, and Top Rank maybe wasn't interested at the price point that they offered to begin with. But whatever the case, Shakur Stevenson is going to take some criticism for the second time in a row fighting an opponent who's coming off of a loss, because Artem Harutyunyan, or however you pronounce it.
Artunian. Got you there.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a YAN and a YUN that kind of just gets mashed together in some ways. But
we've spent our capital on fixing
pronunciations. Yeah, it's based on my Olympic experience. I think I'm fixated on pronouncing fighters' names correctly, which I probably have not done. But at any rate, Artem Harutyunyan gave Frank Martin a tougher fight than people anticipated, but he hadn't fought in the year between then. And then again, gets a lightweight title shot coming off of a loss. So is Shakur Stevenson just going to fight guys coming off of losses in his title defenses, or is he going to fight William Zepeda? Now, I don't think it's Shakur Stevenson's fault that he's not fighting William Zepeda next. It's my understanding, and I believe it's yours, Chris, that William Zepeda did not want to take that fight in the fall here because his wife is pregnant. She's going to have a baby. He wanted to be around for that. He couldn't focus on training.
Completely understandable. Yeah.
Yes. And yeah, you have to take a title shot when it's there. So luckily for him, and I'm not saying the birth of your child isn't more important than fighting Shakur Stevenson, but to kind of go hand in hand with the amount of money you would make from that fight. But at the same time, they're fine with it. They're fine with him fighting on the Stevenson side. They're fine with him fighting someone in the interim, presumably winning, and then going to the Zepeda fight in February. If that's what happens, then all is well that ends well, right? If that's not what happens for whatever reason, well, then we have an even bigger problem and a bigger issue with him fighting a guy who's not a lightweight, coming off a knockout loss, buried on an undercard in Riyadh. There's a lot of things not to like about Stevenson's debut with Matchroom, but the other thing I would say, Chris, is it's been portrayed a little bit that Shakur Stevenson isn't as big a star as he should be, and Matchroom's going to be able to do that for them. And Eddie Hearn's one of the best promoters in boxing. I'm not faulting Eddie, but Shakur Stevenson's all of his fights virtually were on ESPN. You're not going to get better exposure than that anywhere. There are 300 plus million people in the United States, and I don't know, 75 million of them still have ESPN subscriptions, whether it's through the ESPN Plus app or linear cable or whatever. So it's about as visible as you can be on American television. And if he didn't quite capitalize on all those opportunities, specifically the Edwin De Los Santos fight and this last fight against Harutyunyan, well, that's on him. And he was also brought to his hometown where in Shakur's defense, he did very well. I mean, he became a ticket seller in, a very depressed place in Newark, New Jersey, where, selling boxing tickets or tickets to anything, frankly, is not that easy. So he became a ticket seller there. If you can sell 8, 9, 10,000 tickets in your hometown, that's not nothing in the American market, where you maybe don't even need one hand among American fighters of guys who are capable of doing that.
Yeah, I agree. The only question I'd ask Shakur Stevenson is what happened with Tank, because it seemed like the stars were aligning to make that fight realistic. You had Tank coming off a win right around the same time as Shakur was coming off his win. Both guys 135-pound champions. Shakur, a promotional free agent. If there has not been an easier time to make that fight. So that would be my question, because it did seem like at one point both those guys wanted it. They were talking about it. Now that Shakur has signed this deal with Matchroom, I'm not exactly sure where Tank's going to go. I mean, Jose Valenzuela's out there with a title at 140 pounds. There really isn't much to offer at 135. Isaac Cruz is certainly off the table till he gets some of his momentum back. That would be my question. Like, why did a Tank deal not come together? Because that would have been the exact kind of fight that Shakur Stevenson's been asking for.
Well, I think primarily the reason that did not come close to happening is because Gervonta Davis, the representatives, as you know, Chris, for Gervonta Davis and Vasily Lomachenko were negotiating for them to fight next. And I think they just were too far apart on percentages and all that type, all the things that go into a pay-per-view deal, and they moved away from that. And it's my understanding that maybe Vasily Lomachenko doesn't fight again. I mean, that could be the direction he heads in, but he was not pleased with the deal that was presented to him or the numbers that were presented to him. And they did spend some time on the negotiating side between Top Rank and Gervonta Davis's people on the PBC side. They did, it went on for a couple of months basically. So not every day necessarily, but they did have some conversations about it. And then I guess maybe Shakur Stevenson got lost in that mix somewhere because Gervonta Davis thought there was a real opportunity to Lomachenko fight would happen, I guess. I mean, there's no reason they couldn't have revisited it once they realized that it would not happen. But
and that's been a while now, right? Like that's
it
been
has, it has. But again, if the plan for Shakur is to fight William Zepeda and get him, I'm not saying Joe Cordina is an easy fight. I mean, Joe Cordina is a former world champion. He didn't look particularly good in his last fight, I didn't think, but and he hasn't proven himself in this division, but he's a real guy. I mean, for whatever that's worth, I mean, he's a real guy. So I think that was the blueprint. And of course, Joe Cordina is promoted by Eddie Hearn's company, so that made it make sense as well. So I think that's kind of what happened. I also don't think really, Chris, to be honest with you, coming off of Shakur's last two performances, which have not been the most aesthetically pleasing boxing matches that we've ever seen, I think he needs to rebuild some momentum before really making the Tank Davis fight something that people will buy en masse. Because if he goes and beats William Zepeda in February, let's say he beats Cordina, beats William Zepeda fight, I don't think that's going to be a rough fight for Shakur. I don't think that's going to be an easy fight at all. So if he goes and wins,
50-50 fight to me. I know that people think Shakur will outbox him. Some people think Zepeda is just like this wild Mexican puncher. He's not. He is not. He is an accurate puncher. There is a method to his madness when he's in the ring. It's a tough fight.
A real fight, Chris. And if he wins that, he reestablishes some of the momentum he probably had before he fought De Los Santos. And then you can revisit him fighting Gervonta Davis and have some reasonable expectation that would be a commercial success. Because right now, I don't necessarily think that it would be. I mean, people would buy it because they're undefeated American lightweight champions. It's a boxer against a perceived puncher who is much more calculated and smart than maybe in some circles he gets credit for. Gervonta Davis is not some brawl, like you said about William Zepeda. He's not some brawl. He's a calculated guy who's, very economical with his punches and one of the most devastating punchers and knockout artists in the sport. So it's a contrast in styles in that way. But I do think they just kind of need to reestablish some of the momentum they might have once had. And that's really on Shakur Stevenson to do that over the course of the next 6-7 months.
It's a good point because I think if Shakur Stevenson beats William Zepeda, it's going to be because he knocked him out. I don't think Shakur wins a decision against Zepeda. I don't think anybody wins a decision against Zepeda. He throws 100 punches around, and like I said, they're accurate shots. So I do think Zepeda is vulnerable. Like we've seen him drop before, and I think if you punch with him, you can clip him. And I think Shakur's got enough pop to hurt Zepeda. So if he knocks out Zepeda, all of a sudden, you're right. All that momentum is back. He just knocked out the boogeyman at 135. Tank would presumably still be there. You're right. There is, though, a lot of what ifs, though, right? Like, again, Zepeda could beat him, and that would make all this completely irrelevant. So I think there's a bit of a roll of the dice going on right now with Shakur Stevenson with respect to the Tank fight maybe being there before sometime next summer or whenever it ultimately may be. We got a good fight coming up in about a week or so. Inoue back fighting at 122 pounds, undisputed champ at 122. He will make a title defense against former title holder TJ Doheny. I say Doheny because that's what my pal Brian Kenny used to call him back in the days when Doheny was fighting on DAZN. Doheny's won 3 fights in a row, all 3 in Japan, bouncing back from a tough stretch that saw him lose 4 of his last 6. Keith, this is the second straight title defense for Inoue following that knockout win over Luis Nery back in May. Any issues on your part with this fight?
You're really taking some liberties with the word good in describing this fight. Boy,
I was trying to be nice. We've been beating up on so many fights. And I like TJ a lot. Like I called this fight when he fought was it Daniel Roman years and years ago, early in the DAZN days. Nice guy, and I'm glad he kind of rebuilt himself. But I do agree with you. It's
very nice guy. A lot of nice guys that don't belong fighting Inoue
probably
or
true.
other
So I think you're
champions.
answering your own question right there.
Yeah. Look, he should be. I'm not saying that Sam Goodman has any chance whatsoever to beat Inoue. However, he earned the opportunity. So ideally, he would be the one fighting Inoue next week. But Sam Goodman's people went ahead and scheduled him for a fight in early July,
That was
which took,
crazy. Like that was
well, there are some thoughts on the side of Inoue. His people think that they did that on purpose because while they say they want the fight,
like
they
they're right.
really don't because they understand that going to Japan and beating Naoya Inoue is a recipe for your career
He'd do
ending
that
at
fight
the
on the
top
moon
level.
and he'd still get knocked
No,
out.
I know. I'm just saying,
I know.
of course, of course, it could be in Australia. It really doesn't matter. But
Go ahead. Do it
Sam Goodman
Australia.
has had the one thing is Sam Goodman has had a good little run here. He's been very active. He won a couple of fights. Maybe that I didn't think he was going to beat Ray Salim. Maybe I was a little higher on Aleem than I should have been going into that fight, but I expected him to beat Sam Goodman, and Sam Goodman eked out what I thought he deserved to win, but it was a close fight. And he beat TJ Doheny. So he didn't just beat Doheny, he beat him convincingly. So he's the number one contender in the IBF. He beat Doheny convincingly. So quite naturally, TJ Doheny is the one fighting Naoya Inoue next week because this is boxing, the theater of the absurd.
Hey, TJ's big
So
in Japan now. TJ
he
is
is,
big in
and
Japan.
well, it's interesting, Chris, because they have used Doheny on numerous undercards in a row, including Inoue undercards, as a backup. They've done that, in COVID type of situations and, in the event someone gets hurt or whatever. So he's been there for that reason, and he's knocked off a couple of Japanese fighters who they thought were going to beat him and kind of put himself in this position. I want to say he's ranked like sixth by the IBF or something, Doheny, coming off of that. From the time he lost to Sam Goodman, I think he's won 3 or 4 fights in a row, and he's put himself back in the position where he's in the top 15, but he's 37 years old. Not the biggest puncher anyway. And, in a way, to his credit, for a guy at his level, also arguably the best pound for pound fighter in the sport. He's very active. This will be his 4th fight in just about 13 months or so. He's a big draw in Japan. They don't care whether he's fighting TJ Johanny or Sam Goodman. They could not care less. They're coming to fill that arena to see him, knock someone out violently like he usually does. So it doesn't really matter to them all that much. So, but for the rest of us, for the boxing fans and media throughout the world, yeah, you want to see him challenged a little bit more than I think he's going to be challenged next Tuesday. But I've seen worse, I guess I could say. Look, we've discussed. I'll say this: on this podcast, we've discussed worse. So I don't know what's going on right now in boxing. It seems like all we've done for the last how many ever minutes I've been on this podcast, it seems like we've discussed one nonsensical fight after another that just should not have been made. But that's where we are on August, whatever today is.
26th. Yes. As we wind down the month of August, wind down the summer, we're talking about ridiculous fights. Look, I mean, I get why they're doing it. Look, as a boxing fan, would I have rather have seen MJ Akhmadaliev in that fight? Probably, but it's not like Akhmadaliev's done a lot since that loss to Marlon Tapales to really earn the opportunities. Won one fight since then. And TJ's been, like you said, around Japan, beating up on some Japanese fighters, kind of a known commodity. He's a tough guy. He'll try in the ring, that's for sure. Never been stopped. I think that probably ends next Tuesday. But he's going to bring a fight. And if you're just looking at a stay busy type of option, it kind of is what it is. The question is, what is the next big fight for Inoue? I mean, I think we all want to see the Nakatani fight, see Nakatani move up and fight at 122. I don't know how close that is, though. I mean, Nakatani's been talking about moving up to make that fight. Inoue has talked in the past about making that fight. I mean, that should be his next fight, right? Like if Nakatani says, I'm moving up to 122, like that's a huge, that's a Super Bowl type event over in Japan.
Specifically because there's not a lot for him in the featherweight division, Chris. There was a lot of talk last year about Inoue moving up to 126 and conquering another division. Robeisy Ramirez was the preferred opponent of Top Rank. They were going to, bring Ramirez over there, and he fought on his undercard and all that kind of stuff. And then he, of course, gets knocked off by Rafael Espinoza. So the momentum for that, went away. That's not going to happen, of course. So who would he fight in the featherweight division that would make it worthwhile for him to move up? Now, he still makes 122 quite comfortably, so he could stay there for as long as he wants. And the Nakatani fight, as you said, is a huge domestic fight. It's one that I think a lot of people are starting to think that Nakatani, based on his size and his punching power, has a real chance to win, even though he's the smaller man theoretically coming up.
Hmm.
So I think that's the fight to make. And you've discussed this on the podcast with me, and I'm sure other people in the past. I think that is the fight that needs to be made. Um, I don't know. He's supposed to fight in December. I don't know necessarily that it would happen in December because Nakatani, I believe, is fighting next month or in October. So I don't know if that's realistic for then, or maybe that's the fight in the spring. But that's a Tokyo Dome type of fight, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you get two Japanese, undefeated fighters going at it. I mean, that's something people want to see.
Yeah, it's a great fight. And for Inoue, and we don't need to go down this road again, but like I think you stay at 122 until the end of 2025 to see where Bam Rodriguez is, because I think that is the mainstream mega fight that would resonate on multiple continents. Maybe in between, you see if Turki Al-Sheikh has an appetite for bringing you to the UK, to Saudi Arabia, make some money that way. If you got to fight the Sam Goodmans of the world, maybe there's a chance to make even more money doing it in Saudi Arabia. But I think you got to wait for Bam and see what comes of that in the next year and a half.
Chris, the one thing that I've been repeatedly told by people who would know is that Inoue is not going to fight in Saudi Arabia. He's going to stay right there in Japan, make a lot of money, not
Like
have
Canelo in that sense. Like you don't have
yeah.
to. Like I'm just going to stay in my comfort zone and continue to rake in the cash.
No one's going to if I'm him, I'm going to say, look, I'm a big star right here. Anybody who wants a piece, come and get it. You can come right over here. You get paid well for the trouble. Someone's eventually going to beat him like every other fighter, right? So, but if I'm him, I'm in a position of strength. I don't need the Saudi money. I don't need to go to Riyadh or anywhere else they might want me to fight. So I don't see him doing that. And as you said, if Goodman comes around and realizes it's now or never to get this type of opportunity, maybe he's his opponent in December. And if he's not, maybe it's Akhmadaliev, because that's a fight people would want to see. I don't think Akhmadaliev would beat him because he lost to Marlon Tapales, and Marlon Tapales obviously lost to Inoue. But Akhmadaliev is very good. I mean, he's a tremendous fighter. So it's a fight I think people would be more excited about. They would definitely be more excited about it than the TJ Noheny fight, because no one really thinks that should be happening. So, but he's remaining active. He'll fight one more time before the end of the year. And then I think maybe we start seeing some momentum start to build toward that Nakatani fight.
Yeah. And look, in 2025, he gets Nakatani and end of the year, maybe a fight against Bam. I mean, that's a big year for any fighter, for Inoue in particular. Last thing for you, Diego Pacheco, 168-pound contender. He is back on Saturday, his second fight of 2024, putting his undefeated record on the line. He takes on former middleweight title challenger Maciej Sulecki. Pacheco did not look great, Keith, in his last time out, going the distance with Sean McCallman. But he is back, looking to protect that number one spot in the WBO 168-pound rankings. In front of him will be Sulecki, a longtime 160-pounder who has lost to Daniel Jacobs. He has lost to Demetrius Andrade, went the distance in both fights. What do you think of this fight for Diego Pacheco?
I think the two things that I'd be looking for, one is inside the ring and one is outside of the ring on Saturday night, Chris. So inside the ring, I'd like to see if Diego Pacheco as the natural super middleweight among the two, because as you said, Sulecki's mostly been a middleweight. He's fought at super middleweight a couple of times here, but he's 35 years old. He hasn't fought someone at the top level since he fought your beloved Demetrius Andrade 5 years ago.
Can I just say this? Not because you opened the door. Like, that Sulecki fight was maybe the worst moment for Demetrius Andrade, because his career could have gone two places during that fight. Knocked Sulecki down in the first round, looked like he had a chance to knock him out early, and then he goes back to the corner and comes out in the second round and is boxing again. Like, if he had gotten a first or second round knockout against Sulecki, I think we'd be having a different conversation about Demetrius Andrade's career because of where it would have gone after that fight. But again.
Yeah. And I think, related to that, I think several times you could point to several Demetrius Andrade fights where he kind of let his opponent off the hook, where he could have gotten him out of there, like the Akinwanda, whatever the guy's name was.
But this was a fight, Keith, I know
knocked him down 4 times and didn't knock him out,
Eddie Reynoso was watching that fight. Like, Eddie Reynoso, like, that was a point where he could have been in that Canelo mix. Eddie Reynoso was watching that fight. And I remember talking to people in that Canelo camp, and they were like, well, I mean, he's just going to move. We don't want to fight guys like that. Like, it just didn't, if he had gone out there and gone for a knockout, I really believe he would have gotten a Canelo fight. I really believe that. But the fact that he went 12 and kind of made it a Demetrius Andrade type fight, that didn't do him any favors.
You fight with no body, man.
Nobody. Nice work with that. But it's
Um,
like I tend to agree with you on Zaleski. I mean, in addition to losing at the highest level and being 35 years old, he's also a little bit chinny, right? Knocked down by Andrade, knocked down by Daniel Jacobs, knocked down twice by Gabe Rosado. Not exactly the biggest puncher in the world. Now he's up at 168 with just 268-pound fights under his belt. You know, if Pacheco lost his momentum in that McCalman fight, I think this is a great opportunity for him to get it back.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with this point originally, Chris, was that, that's what I want to see from Diego Pacheco on Saturday night. I want to see him knock Maciej Zaleski out. He has not been stopped in his career. His only two losses are relatively lopsided 12-round unanimous decision defeats to Demetrius Andrade and Daniel Jacobs. It's fine that he's fighting him. I don't know, because there's not really much for him that would have made sense on Labor Day weekend in a hometown type of fight and all that kind of stuff. So, but Zaleski hasn't really fought anyone at the top level since he fought Andrade. That fight, I believe, was in June of 2019. It's been over 5 years since he really fought anybody. And this is not really his fault either, because he was waiting around for that Jamal Charlo fight to be rescheduled. He wasted a year of his career waiting for that to be rescheduled. It never was. So Zaleski, has an opportunity here to knock off a young ascending fighter. I don't think that he will. And I want to see Diego Pacheco go and take him out, because you said the first 5 or 6 rounds of that Sean McCalman fight, you could argue that McCalman was winning. And then I thought Diego Pacheco made some adjustments in the back end of that fight, and I thought he won. I thought he deserved to win. What was it, 96, 94, 97, 93 might be a little wide, but he won. I don't think there was any discrepancy about who won. I thought McCalman showed well that night because he hadn't fought anyone as good as Pacheco. And I thought he, probably put himself in position to make more paydays against other super middleweights down the line. But I want to see Pacheco regain some of that momentum, as you said, Chris, because he's 23 years old. He's a Mexican-American kid who has developed somewhat of a following. And the other thing, as I mentioned, I wanted to see 2 things on Saturday night. I want to see him knock out Zaleski, and I also want to see what type of crowd assembles at the old Home Depot Center to see this fight, because the tickets there are generally priced pretty cheaply. They're reasonably priced tickets. It's a holiday weekend. People are maybe looking for something to do on a Saturday night when you have Sunday off and all that type of stuff. And if you could take your, family, or you go with your buddies or whatever, and see some, reasonably entertaining boxing, you would hope that he could get a pretty good crowd over there, because the last fight was at that Fontainebleau place in Vegas, which is all just about a site deal between the promoter and the venue and everything. So you don't really learn much from that. But he has fought in the Los Angeles area before. So I'd like to see him become more of an attraction in that sense. And if he does that, both. Right, of course. No, and look what they, from their perspective, this is what you're supposed to do, right? You take the guy to his hometown and see what you've got. That's what they did with Jaron Ennis, and it worked out better than probably they even imagined when they put those tickets on sale. So you do the same thing here with Diego Pacheco, and now he has to deliver in the ring. So if he goes there and beats up Maciej Zaleski and stops him, he's already the #1 ranked contender by the WBO. I don't know where he goes necessarily, Chris,
I don't either.
Well, that's the thing, right? Because Canelo is not going to, I'm not saying he's afraid to fight Diego Pacheco or Christian Mbili or any of these types of guys. I just don't think he sees any point in it. I don't know what he sees a point in it at this point, to be honest with you, because he shouldn't be fighting Edgar Berlanga either. But so let's just see what happens. He's going to beat Berlanga convincingly and then see where Canelo goes from there. But if he is willing to stay at 168 pounds and defend his titles, and he's not going to fight David Benavidez or David Morrell, which neither of those fights seem anywhere close to happening, maybe he fights the other guy that Jose Benavidez Sr. trains, right? I mean, but, so, and then maybe that would create some intrigue related to the Benavidez fight. Maybe he would then consider fighting Benavidez, and they drum up some interest when he fights Diego Pacheco. I don't see Pacheco as someone who could beat Canelo at this point. But he's an entertaining fighter, and he's young and he's undefeated. He's Mexican-American. I mean, that type of fight would sell among Mexican-American fans for sure. So maybe you would have something there. Or Canelo just gives up all the titles, and then whatever he winds up, maybe he still fights at super middleweight. He doesn't need the title. He's Canelo Alvarez, for God's sake. I mean, look what he's doing next month. He's fighting Edgar Berlanga, and he's going to make tens of millions of dollars for a fight that no one wants to see. So he's
And
still
nobody cares about the titles in that one either. Nobody's
nobody
watching
cares
that
about
fight.
the titles anyway. Yeah, I mean, so he's still the undisputed champion. It's unfortunate that for whatever reason he's not fighting David Benavidez, and that's all on Canelo. But maybe you then have kind of you have guys like Diego Pacheco, Christian Mbili, whoever wins the Munguia Bazinian fight, which I would assume would be Munguia on September 20th. You have some guys that are all kind of comparable on a similar level, and they could make some fan-friendly fights and some entertaining fights that would be reasonably priced for either DAZN or ESPN or whichever streaming service or network would put it on. You could really have some fun times in the super middleweight division if you make the right fights. And I think Pacheco could be in that mix very easily. And that's all, of course, based on him winning and looking good on Saturday night. But I think he will do that.
Yeah. The potential fight I'd be watching if I was Matchroom and Diego Pacheco is this William Skull, Vladimir Shishkin fight for that IBF belt. Which
I knew you were gonna work Skull Shishkin into this podcast at some point. Come on,
I'm a Skullhead, Keith. I am Team Skull. That fight presumably going to take place some point in the next month and a half, whatever it may be. And then that's kind of like a belt for hire, right? It's like what Charles Martin was back when he won his piece of the heavyweight title. It's kind of what Bakram Mutsalayev is now. Like, I've got a belt. If you offer me enough money, I'll fight your guy and put it on in a fight that I'll probably lose. Matchroom was familiar with that. They did that Charles Martin Anthony Joshua fight, the first belt that Anthony Joshua ever won. If I'm Matchroom, I'm looking there, right? Like, that fight is probably going to wind up on DAZN. Dimitri Salita is a co-promoter of that event. I could see that happening. And, you do Pacheco against, I think Shishkin probably wins, but you do Pacheco against Shishkin early next year. It's a good fight for Pacheco. It's a winnable fight for Pacheco that could all of a sudden make him a world champion. And then a lot of doors open up if you're a title holder.
Yeah, he would have more leverage at that point. He's a fun fighter to watch, Chris. He's pretty 6'4", and he's kind of wiry, and he's got that uppercut. He goes to the body with his left hook pretty well. That right uppercut is a money punch for him. He's vulnerable. He's not the best defensive fighter. He's taking some shots that I'm sure Jose Benavidez Sr. doesn't want to see him taking. So he's going to make for some entertaining scraps, and hopefully, like you said, maybe he gets the winner of that fight, or they can make fights with other promoters and other networks that people will want to see. If we're not going to get the fight in the super middleweight division that the whole world wants, Canelo and David Benavidez, well, hopefully we'll get some consolation prizes that would be somewhat satisfying to the paying public, because you just want to see good fights. You want to see competitive fights and what are compelling fights aesthetically on television. And I think you could make several of those in the super middleweight division. And I think Diego Pacheco is right in that mix to be in those fights.
Yeah. And I'm with you on what we need to see. Like, I want to see Pacheco go after him. Like, this is a guy that was not a huge puncher at 160. He's on the older side. He's moving up in weight. I saw what Andre did when Andre went right after him. He knocked him down in that first round. Pacheco's a bigger puncher than Demetrius Andre. And I'd like to see him early on kind of go for it. Go for one of those statement wins. Stop a guy that's never been stopped. Get him out of there first, second, third round, and kind of erase the memory of the McCallman fight. Some of the crap. He wasn't that great against Caceres either. Like, start to get some of that momentum back if you're Diego Pacheco.
Listen, you just want to go home earlier. Cut it out.
Nice.
You don't get paid per round. Come on.
A long weekend for me too, Keith. Keith, good stuff, man. Always appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Chris.